Welcome back to the Authentic Wellness Podcast. My name is Nadia. If this is your first time listening, this is a podcast discussing what it means to be authentically well. At 20 years old, I was diagnosed with CPTSD, and ever since I have been on a journey to advocate and educate others on the complexity that is complex PTSD. In today's episode, we will be covering one of my favorite topics, and that is the brain and its powerful role in allowing us to be humans with heroic resiliency. Before we begin, I do want to note that listeners' discretion is advised as we will be covering some sensitive topics. If you feel that this discussion is too much for you, please feel free to sign off or take a break. And with that all said, let's begin the episode. I know that this will be one of the most important topics I discuss in the whole series, and that is today's topic on the impact that childhood trauma has had on the brain. To be upfront with everything, this topic is the reason why this whole podcast exists. In October of 2021, I was interning at a nonprofit tailored to helping refugees adjust to their life in America, either fleeing for safety or to be reunited with their family. A wonderful organization who will always have a place in my heart. Anyways, my supervisor at the time asked us interns to pick a topic and present on it. Me being fairly comfortable with complex trauma and speaking about my experiences, I decided to speak on trauma, and I would lead way into sharing my story with the organization and other fellow interns. But no, I, during this presentation, did very little of sharing my story, but instead I shared the story of many others instead. Many children who are now adults to suffer the physical and mental consequences from being traumatized as children or teenagers. I honestly only knew how to give a general spiel on CPTSD, but never really looked to the neurology of the brain. And like I've said before, I can only study and talk about things that interest me, and neurology was one of them. Since I was a kid, I had always been interested in the brain and how the brain works and how it controls our behavior and our actions, our directions in this life. I made a quick correlation between negative brain behavior as a consequence of trauma in individuals who are in the developing stages. So people under the age of 25. So like I was saying, I composed a brief PowerPoint on the impact that trauma had on the brain. Didn't rehearse at all what I was going to say. Because of COVID, we were obviously remote, so I would be in the comfort of my own home while presenting. I hopped onto this meeting and did what I do with every presentation. I winged it. I wing a lot of things because I hate losing time. Losing time and overthinking what I was going to say, so I was just going to say what my brain said we were going to say that day. My PowerPoint had 3 sections: the definitions of trauma, of the PTSD versus CPTSD clarification, the definitions of brain structure, and the second sections listed how the brain interprets trauma, the role of the brain structures, their function, and chemical role during and after the traumatic event. And the last segment consisted of possible treatment suggestions and suggestions on how to work with clients who had been impacted by complex trauma. I did my presentation, and it's as if the words flowed in the most articulate way. I delivered a presentation none like I have ever done before, and I felt good about it. That's what I will always remember, the way that I felt about it, and that I was proud of myself, something I don't feel very often. I was, of course, the first one to go because waiting to present is an anxiety attack waiting to happen for me. After the meeting, I closed my laptop and went to get food. All was well. The following weeks, I had a one-on-one meeting with my supervisor, and I thought to ask him what he thought, what I did wrong, and how I could improve with my trauma presentations. He looked at me through the screen and almost paused. Was a connection okay? I think what he said next changed my whole career, and I don't mean that to be dramatic. I say this to explain why this podcast exists, why this voice of mine exists, and why a girl who grew up preferring to die than to get up in front of the classroom and read a sentence can now deliver such heavy speeches to hundreds of people. His words went along the lines of this: your presentation was one I have not been able to forget. The way you delivered it is something I have only seen in a very few number of people, because only a very few number of people do that when presenting, stating that you have a gift and you can't stop. The words he said obviously took a little bit to process. I was like, OMG, really? Okay, thanks. I had no words. I even think I said that to him. I have no words. And he replied, well, you better find them because I want you to speak at other events with me, with audiences bigger than you've ever been in front of. Well, shit. You're telling me that I'm good at something for once because I've never been told I've been good at anything. Ever. Ever. And this man was telling me I was good at talking. Of course I was like, yes, I love to speak at so-and-so event. But in the back of my mind, I was like, yo, you know what you just signed up for? Back out now before it's too late. You'll mess up. It'll be embarrassing. You see, it all comes full circle. We expose the trauma and it exposes us back by saying we are not good enough. That hidden pain we have preserved in our souls will always say we are not good enough for greatness because greatness is not what we know. Flash forward a couple months later and I was guest speaking at a board meeting with the organization. I was leading trainings and speaking to master's students at the University of Maryland. And now I'm doing this. Life is so unpredictably weird, and on this podcast you're going to find out why. After all that jazz, I want to actually get into the topic of the brain and why it is so important. To begin, I want to address 3 ways that the brain can be impacted by trauma, because humans tend to carry with them everything that they experience, whether they choose to or not. The first one is physical. You're probably like, obviously, people who endure trauma to the head obviously get physical brain damage. But did you know trauma involving no form of blunt force to the head can physically shrink the brain structure by 40% in children whose needs have not been met? Did you know the brain's neural connections and activity become significantly less active in the abused brain of a child or individuals with PTSD in comparison with a non-abused brain? And by abuse, it can mean physical, emotional, mental, sexually, and adversity that creates ongoing stress for the individual at any age. These statistics are derived from Tim Fletcher's Complex Trauma series on YouTube. I highly suggest everyone check it out. Second is chemical. What do we think about when we think of positive emotion in the brain? Serotonin, dopamine, pleasure. Did you know people who have experienced some form of childhood trauma are unable to produce these happy chemicals as they age, or they have a decreased presence of the production of these chemicals in the brain, thus making them more susceptible to things like depression, irritability, anxiety, the list goes on. And the third is the functional level. What do we do, and how do we act as a person with trauma that is so far away and long gone, but with our past ever so lively in our bodies and brains? How does it all tie together? The physical alterations of the brain producing little or too much of the chemicals. How does that impact our adult or developing lives? How we have made ourselves act and how we go about being contributing members to society or lack thereof. In this episode, we're going to be talking more specifically on how trauma affects the brain in these 3 ways. But first, I want to get into the anatomy of the brain, which to me is probably the most fascinating to learn about. Given that I, of course, do not have all the time in the world, I'm going to talk about 5 main physical structures of the brain and how they are impacted by trauma. Inside our brain, we have something called the limbic system. It's a part of the brain that causes us to behave or respond directly when it comes to survival. It's essentially responsible for a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Within the limbic system are parts of the brain heavily involved with the processing of trauma, parts of the brain that play a big role in the traumatic situation before, during, and after everything takes place. I think one of the most important components we often hear about while studying anything about those reactions is the amygdala. I often associate the amygdala with the area where the fear stems from, the root source of what fear is. The amygdala is super crucial when it comes to trauma because it remembers everything that scares us. It holds memories for us of events which were traumatic in order to keep us safe. It takes previous situations to warn us of danger by allowing us to feel fear. Being one of the first parts of the brain to develop, it has such significance because it starts working before we leave the womb. This can explain the impact of trauma before birth, which can impact the person throughout their whole life. Given that the amygdala is in place to prioritize survival, when we experience these memories of fear, it's always going to feel as they are happening right now, leading to being triggered, which can cause panic attacks to happen. Another thing to note about this brain structure is how the amygdala affects the thinking brain. The more often the amygdala is worked up, the ability to think and reason diminishes. Let's look at our prefrontal cortex. If we separate the functions apart between what it does when we experience trauma and what it does in a state of calm, we get very different things. The prefrontal cortex is mainly responsible for creative thinking and high-level reasoning. It regulates emotion and allows us to observe those of others. It's the reason we are able to read social cues, understand social situations, and be part of our surroundings. It keeps memories that are similar together and ties things together for us, making connections. But let's make note that this is not one area of our brain that is activated when we experience triggers or are facing something traumatic. This is an area of the brain impacted by trauma at a functional level, as there tends to be decreased activation in this area when trauma survivors are reintroduced to other traumatic events. Therefore, when we are in a state of trauma, our ability to think clearly is altered because there is a disconnection from the prefrontal cortex. Another area located behind the left eye in the frontal cortex is the Broca's area, which is responsible for speech. We've all heard of speechless terror in movies where characters are scared they can't even form words. I once thought this was just for dramatic effect, but it turned out to be an actual real thing. I experienced this myself at 11 years old for the first time, and it is something I never quite forgot. The brain was powerful enough to disable my physical ability to form words as a result of being frozen in fear. It was a paralyzing feeling I will never quite forget. Another great example of senses shutting off is when, in the midst of fight or flight, the body prepares itself to respond, with the sole purpose being survival. We're going to move on to the hippocampus. Given that we are discussing parts of the brain affected on a functional and physical level, parts that simply suffer the effects of fight or flight, the fight or flight response, and the trauma. We're going to move on to one of the most complex structures. This structure in the limbic system holds together our conscious memories and provides us with knowledge in the order of events in which they took place. This is where the short-term memory becomes the long-term memory. When an individual is put under high stress, the stress hormones impair the hippocampus's ability to store conscious memory, thus affecting the ability to remember the order of events or how the incident occurred. Physical shrinkage of the hippocampus is also associated with people who have PTSD, as the damage from high stress has made it difficult to retain memory and learn new skills. Now, let's actually talk about what happens when the brain senses danger. What actually happens during trauma? So when we experience trauma, the amygdala is the first one to make us aware that something feels wrong, that something feels dangerous or scary. So when we experience trauma, the amygdala is the first one to make us aware that something feels wrong, that something feels dangerous or scary. And he's going to send a message to the HPA. The HPA stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The HPA is responsible for controlling reactions to stress and regulates many processes in the body. Our HPA is going to be the one to release a bunch of hormones throughout the body and the autonomic nervous system specifically to prepare the body for fight or flight. The way my psychology teacher taught us was atomic automatic. The ANS controls automatic functions such as heart rate and breathing. It controls many bodily functions we don't think about, such as digestion and temperature. One of the most common hormones we know of is cortisol. It's another word for a stress hormone that the HPA is going to release to the brain. When cortisol is released, as we mentioned, the three areas, the Broca's area, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, these three areas are going to be affected as their functioning is going to be reduced by the release of cortisol from the HPA. Therefore, the cortisol is going to affect our speech. It's going to affect our belief, our thinking. It's going to affect the ability to remember things in order of how they happened. When stress hormones are released from the HPA, it's also going to affect the sympathetic nervous system. This is going to make you prepared to face the danger as your breathing is going to get heavier and you're going to become more tense. You become more hypervigilant, your heart races, etc. What the SNS is going to do is push you to do one of three things: fight, flight, or freeze. Flight happens when you perceive that fighting is necessary. Fight happens when you perceive that fighting is necessary to survive. It displays the emotion of anger. It warrants adrenaline, and the adrenaline is what momentarily numbs pain so you can keep fighting. The flight is a learned response to feeling unsafe. It means to evacuate the area where the danger is occurring, to avoid it because remaining in that space can lead to unwanted consequences. And the final one being freeze, where the brain dissociates from the body, separates themselves from the environment because what is happening is too much for the person to handle. This is a hard trauma to recognize because victims often display no outward emotion or behavior because they are stuck within themselves as they are frozen in fear, paralyzed, and unable to help themselves due to the gravity of the situation. One of the more complicated aspects when looking at how trauma affects the brain and the body comes from the chemicals and neurotransmitters involved in the process of the body sensing danger. There is only so much knowledge I possess here, but one day I hope to know the ins and outs of all the biochemical reactions that take place in the body when put under extreme stress. I want to include a bit about biology and chemistry to further help people understand how complex this subject is, how deep we can dive into the topic of trauma, and how learning about these chemical reactions and ongoing effects of these unwarranted states, and how much of an impact it can have on adult development and quality of life. I believe knowing more can definitely change the onlook of treatment and how we view people who are survivors of trauma. I want to begin with further explaining the HPA axis. The HPA axis serves to control our reactions to stress and to help regulate the body. The body thrives when it is regulated, when everything is balanced. As you've seen with the field of health, if something is off or unbalanced, the body is going to create a reaction in an attempt to tell you that something is wrong. When the HPA axis is under stress, it has the ability to suppress the immune system as a mechanism to take energy from it and put it towards fighting our current situation. The HPA also takes power in the mind and eliminates mood and emotion by shutting them off in the moment so we can focus on what is right in front of us. This is where I want to properly introduce cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. You've heard me use this term before, basically a type of hormone. The cortisol is released by adrenal glands, endocrine glands, and kidneys to help regulate the body during stress. When the HPA axis goes off, a large amount of cortisol is released. The main role of cortisol is to release glucose. It takes glucose from other areas of the body, such as organs that program the immune system and convert the glucose into energy to combat the stress. Glucocorticoids are hormones that may interfere with memory. Therefore, a big issue when it comes to PTSD is the inability to recall the traumatic event in detail or order of which the event took place. A big factor being the cortisol because it inhibits the formation of memories. Over time, if people endure ongoing chronic stress, there can be an abnormal regulation of neurochemicals and hormones in our bodies. Our chemical structure legitimately changes over time from the release of cortisol. And I'm not even 2% into talking about what cortisol does to you, so I'm gonna need to make a whole other episode on this alone a later time. Anyways, we see cortisol affecting our recall and our processing of events in general. So we have another chemical called norepinephrine that tries really hard to counterbalance the cortisol and is able to retain fear memories. We from then on remember what we are scared of or what scared us during the trauma. Another chemical I want to talk about is glutamate, which binds to the NMDA, which is its receptor. They have what is called synaptic plasticity, which serves to form memory of events that happen. However, something to note is that glutamate is mainly released during high levels of stress. If we experience ongoing stress, the glutamate is bursting out here. Did you know too much glutamate in our brains causes our brain cells to die because it becomes excitotoxic to the brain? What happens when our brain cells die? Many unfortunate things. We become more sensitive to cortisol. The NMDA becomes more attentive to the glutamate, which in turn increases the likelihood of brain cells dying. The hippocampus begins to lose physical volume due to high levels of cortisol. The decrease in volume is due to repeated exposure of corticoid levels going up or down. All these changes happening to our brain is going to have drastic consequences on our ability to emotionally regulate. When we talk about neurotransmitters, we are talking about part of the nervous system that is released by nerve cells. Some relative neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which we just mentioned. We know that low levels of serotonin can lead to depression, and low levels of dopamine affect the way people feel pleasure and experience joy. But what happens before we come to this conclusion? What changes occur over time as a result of our trauma that take us as teenagers and adults to a place of sheer hopelessness and existential crisis? When humans experience toxic stress, the intensity from the stress and from the stress occurring repeatedly over time will increase the release of certain neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline. These give us the ability to perform the fight or flight or freeze or combat the stressor. From then, the body is going to have surges or spikes of cortisol, as we just learned what too much cortisol does over time. It degrades the body. It takes energy from organs and it surges it all at once, and over time, not at all. It's the whole notion of being constantly imbalanced. With our HPA axis being dysregulated in adulthood, we can see things like hypocortisolism or low cortisol. We depend on serotonin to maintain our mood, to make us pleasant. But having cortisol suppress serotonin makes us irritable, unwelcoming, or unpleasant to be with. We see this with the mood swings and depression in PTSD patients. Neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, catecholamine neurotransmitters, become negatively affected from the damage done to the hippocampus. We then go on to struggle with focusing, remembering memories, and coping with recurring flashbacks and triggers on a day-to-day basis. I want to move the conversation to 5 common behaviors I see in almost all trauma survivors. I believe this will allow us to understand how the brains of trauma survivors really work over time and unfortunately experience some negative consequences that are too common to not talk about. So how do brain physical structures, brain waves, and chemicals play a role in these 5 common behaviors, and what role did our development play to make us out to be this way? The first one is mood instability, our highs and lows. We learned that toxic stress leads to emotional dysregulation. When individuals with trauma disorders experience adversity or become triggered, even ever so slightly, they feel emotions more intensely than others. We see that the structural changes in our brains play a significant role in changing our tolerance levels and our perception over time. These are big emotions we are talking about, because something that may occur to someone with little trauma may not warrant such an intense reaction of anger than from someone who has trauma. I do not say exaggerated or dramatic reaction because they are simply not doing that. Because to them, it is a big deal, and it feels like a big deal to lose some keys or get cut off in traffic. The situation may not seem extreme, but their reaction is valid because that's what their brains now do. That's what their brains have programmed themselves to do. Being constantly in states of hypervigilance, constantly working up the central nervous system, making us snap quicker as we age. Our mood fluctuates, leading to mood disorders. A basic explanation to why we are so dysregulated is what has gotten in the way of certain regions in the prefrontal brain to not develop correctly. We can attribute this to our experiences and traumatic events that have prioritized survival through the means of temporarily shutting down or blocking off areas involving regulation, cognition, and adaptation. Parts have been shut off, and if this goes on continuously, the effects are physically there. How you take in and process stimuli will not be how other people take that in based on how your brain has developed. Thus, we exhibit emotions on both ends of the spectrum and struggle to stay in the middle. We were never taught how to emotionally regulate as children, either being punished for expressing strong emotion or forced to numb ourselves, which can create episodes of intense anger or mania in adulthood. Or we can simply lack the ability to show any emotion at all, making us numb and not all there as we grow up. We become trapped in our minds. We feel depressed in our whole body. We feel suffocated and dead inside. It's both sides of the spectrum, and it's because our physical brain structures are either underdeveloped or not functioning at the optimal level. Let's talk about toxic behaviors. I feel like it's common to see people behaving in toxic ways, and I think more often than not we question them, and we question ourselves on why they act that way. We're going into terms of being fake, or someone who does too much for someone, or someone who doesn't care, someone who's selfish or only cares about themselves, someone who lives, who steals, who takes advantage of other people, who downgrades other people, who guilt trips everyone and manipulates, makes impulsive decisions, hurts others or puts people down, people who are obsessive or act violently. It's their personality. We all know people like this. Maybe even we are this or exhibit some behaviors. I'm not saying these kinds of behaviors are excusable due to trauma. Some people are utterly the worst and have trash personalities. But as unexcusable as these behaviors can be, oftentimes people who act like this are reflections of other people who acted like this in front of them, who as children showed them that acting this way is okay and gets you what you want in the moment. Since this is modeled to these kids and portrayed as the only way to act, it makes sense that part of them doesn't know an alternative way to act. They don't understand that acts of selfishness are affecting other people. They struggle to see where they are wrong based on what their environment was like. If being selfish and aggressive meant that they could benefit from this growing up, why not take these toxic behaviors and carry it into adulthood? Since our brain is so adaptive to pattern behavior, would it not make sense to naturally act this way as we grow up? Addictions being a big one. The brain not being able to produce chemicals of pleasure, chemicals that keep us regulated and emotionally well, chemicals that allow us to feel safety and warmth. We have to find it somewhere, and that's where many people turn to addiction. Not just drugs, but habits, obsessions, and addiction with the way we think, with how we analyze, how we become programmed to naturally think in ways that harm us, yet it is all we know how to do. Addiction is a coping mechanism for what is missing. For an empty part inside of you, it attempts to fill the void because your whole life nothing has met certain needs, so we find a way to meet it ourselves. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure, however, since we are dysregulated, we may not be able to control or limit our desires. We constantly seek instant gratification because our lives have been depleted of regular things that need to be satisfied for us to properly develop. Most people with trauma are addicted to something, but addiction is not bad. It's us surviving. What about irrational thoughts, irrational behaviors? We've all had them. With or without consent, our brain is recalling or creating unwanted thoughts in our heads, which can be very disturbing. They can come without warning. Why do we think this way? In part, it's due to our stress or stress in the past. The brain is programmed to think about worst case scenarios because human brains are programmed to survive. We need to understand that brain activity is running rampant when we have these thoughts. The left inferior frontal gyrus and the cingulate cortex are often the areas of the brain responsible for the production of these thoughts. These areas in the frontal part of the brain are affected by trauma. As we know, the frontal brain, responsible for concentration, behaviors, and regulated thinking, can, like the hippocampus, face volume reduction or lack of neural connections needed for brain development and growth. Finally, we have difficulty with relationships, whether with family, friends, partners, and our offspring. More often than not, our parents were also trauma survivors, whether they chose to deal with the trauma or not, and whether repressed memories ever came to light. Trauma is so heavily passed on from one generation to the next, given intentional or not. So, being the child of parents who suffered abuse themselves at the hands of their own caregivers sparks a question to why people with CPTSD have tendencies so similar to their parents, whether they realize it or not. We are not products of trauma. We are the result of unhealed trauma. And we are also the ones who break the cycle. But that doesn't mean their flaws must simply go away with time. It means their flaws are ever so present in front of us all the more. How often do we see children of parents in toxic dysfunctional relationships putting themselves in toxic dysfunctional relationships? How often do we see early pregnancies coming from girls whose mothers were in similar situations? How often do we see girls of abusive fathers enter relationships of domestic violence? We seek what feels comfortable and what we know because it is all that we know, unless something or someone steps in the way. We treat other people as we have been treated because that is all we know how to do. We are raised by our influences, and then we ourselves become the biggest influencers once we enter adulthood. Once we take what we see growing up and put it into practice. So what is going on here in trauma survivors struggle with maintaining healthy relationships? Simply our brain patterns at play. Growing up, we learned that in order to survive, we had to form neural connections on how emotional bonds work. Much of our emotional bonds were rooted around fear. We're rooted around meeting the needs of others and forgetting about ourselves. So that's how we are wired to think as adults. We don't handle conflict well. We escalate it. We lack abilities in areas that resolve situations such as patience, listening skills, and clear thinking when triggered. Not saying that it is our fault that we respond like this in our relationships, but this is how we tend to react when it comes to our interactions with others. We have not developed skills to maintain healthy relationships because it was never modeled for us. Our brains don't know how this works. I want to go on and mention long-term effects on the brain. A lot of us tend to question how we do things and how we think things should be done. I think throughout our lives we go through this active questioning of ourselves if our methods of doing some things are the best way, or if we are just acting something out based on what we have been told or what we know to be true. We all typically understand that what we were taught and what was modeled for us is how we chose to act about most things. Cognitively and physically, we see that our brain changes based on things that happen to us. Our mannerisms are different from someone else's because we were told this is more effective or this yields a better response. There's logic to it, right? However, some of us act solely based on what we know, because this way we can come off cold and sort of put up a front that we are not messed up, that we are not to be messed with. But then you catch yourself doing this stuff unconsciously, repeatedly, and at that point we screw up our relationships, right? And then we think we're the problem. You see, much of how we respond to stimuli, how we choose to act, is so not much of a choice. So like most people, we automatically resort to what is comfortable. What do I know best? And with that, I want to talk about the long-term effects of trauma on the brain. We know that our brains are wired to process a lot of information. We know that all that information is retained in some way, stored in our unconscious or conscious memory. How the hippocampus stores memory of fearful events, so much is our brain wired by trauma in an effort to be prepared for trauma to occur continuously. It is very common for adult survivors of trauma to say things along the lines of, I carry my inner child with me. I cannot abandon the person who I used to be because they are so much still present. So it's no surprise that our mind is still very present with our body and our behaviors. Everything is connected, and because of the concept of time, some things settle, other things we let go of, but one of the things that is nearly impossible to simply abandon or leave behind is our trauma, are these experiences which took so much energy out of us and demanded so much emotion. This is where people struggle hard. If there was a theme to this whole series, it would be that the body and mind are connected with everything. How we act, live, and experience. What we take in is what we put out, and we are mostly unaware of this. I want to look at reactiveness, not as a symptom, but as a result of the equation. How we react, our reactivity levels, our tolerance levels, etc., are based on what we experienced. Some people can be so tolerant, yet others have such a short fuse. It has us questioning if they normally act like this, or is there something more to be looked at? Over time, as people develop, we develop reactivity based on how others reacted towards us. With my case, my parents were very reactive when I wouldn't do something very quickly, when I wasn't good enough, or when I looked at something positively, while they only saw everything as negative. Growing up, I struggled with my patience at an abnormal level. I am not patient whatsoever, and it comes to the point that when I try to be, or when I am forced to be, my body is physically ailing away. I get joint pain when I wait, my head starts hurting, my heart starts racing, all without consent. And for most people, I've heard that you have to train yourself to not be this way. However, given what you know, it takes such a long time to get rid of habits and mannerisms displayed towards you to figure out the appropriate way to act. Similarly, how some people react more dramatically than others when inconveniences occur. Where did they learn that? Or as children, were they shown that this is a way to draw attention to the problem? Or does it make the attention go to you? A child or adult with CPTSD struggles with this regulation. We struggle to perceive if the threat is real. Thus, we intensify our reactions. It's that living in the trauma state that results from repeated exposure to adversity. We can align this with issues of mood or mood swings, becoming increasingly prevalent as we reach adulthood. On the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance website, there's an article explaining why trauma can cause mood disorders. It comes down to changes in the brain, in parts responsible for memory, emotion, and parts that helps us experience more emotion. Mood disorders are more rampant in children and adults who have CPTSD, given that complex trauma unfortunately causes the victim to feel that they cannot escape their situation. It is hopelessness that leaves the brain, the body, with no choice but to adapt for survival. We struggle a lot with our mood. Our inability to feel pleasure leads us into extreme states of depression, anxiety, or feeling of nothing or everything at all. It is not uncommon to see mania in victims of trauma, high intense bouts of energy, racing thoughts, and over-the-top behaviors. Whether you have or have not been diagnosed with bipolar 1 or another mood disorder, it can occur. As we previously touched on what causes these drastic mood swings, what causes the mania, none other than chemical imbalances in the brain. With mania, we're mainly looking at non-adrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin. With people who are bipolar, there's decreased responsiveness in areas of the brain associated with cognitive control and an ability to control your mental processing of what is happening. But on the other hand, we see increased responsiveness in the parts of the brain involved in emotional regulation. It is unfortunate enough, all that trauma survivors go through. But something that I think hits home to most individuals are the cognitive issues that come with the onset of trauma. Whether chronic or acute, it is not a surprise that people who struggle with learning, memory, retention, and simply meeting developmental milestones are people who have had something terrible happen to them or someone they love. We mentioned that when people are growing up in toxic stress, they don't have the time to worry about learning or retaining material or teaching themselves skills that will benefit them in the long run. But not only do they not have the time or energy, they don't have the ability. It is not possible to learn because areas in the brain that form a new neural connection with something when someone learns a concept that are not working as they should. It is not possible to learn because areas of the brain that form a new neural connection when someone learns a concept are not working as they should. Cells are being poisoned by the overwhelming presence of cortisol. The nervous system is turning areas of the brain responsible for learning and development off to bring all the energy to the parts needed for survival. It's a game you can't win. So then we see the academic struggle and we see the developmental struggle. As adults, we become aware that we feel or are behind in comparison with other people our own age. We have missed milestones and are socially behind simply because areas of their brain did not have time to develop when the body usually develops. 4 key areas where cognition is affected are attention and focus, planning and executive function, and our memory and recall and retention. For survivors, there's the invisible presence of trauma that is seen in all that I've discussed here. The knowledge that the trauma not only lives in you, but it is in you, but is you, is a hard reality and concept to grasp. I think people often question themselves more when they are given an identity, and by that I mean when other people have been the reason for how you are today and what negative factors you see in yourself today. The trauma always lingers, even years before the trauma resurfaces. And I think I struggled with mostly not being able to put into words what had happened to me, and the lack of words and knowledge of CPTSD altogether made it nearly impossible for me to claim what was holding me down, and at the same time, what no one could see. So the invisible presence of trauma, it becomes us and walks with us until we look it in the eyes and start erasing and breaking down what happened. As we break down the old self, the current self for some of us, and painfully start to relearn what it means to be alive. Let's rewind a second though. This is my podcast, meant to provide knowledge yet a source for hope for you or someone you know suffering with CPTSD. I still haven't talked about the light that is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's way of healing itself and being able to heal by forming new neural connections for someone who thought the damage of trauma was not reversible. All the physical structures we talked about today are capable of being mended back together and supplied with nutrients that give them strength and an ability to treat us correctly. This healing process can take years, but it is doable, and that's what I want to discuss in a future episode on what it takes to heal from CPTSD and how you can experience freedom from years or decades of hopelessness. But let me talk more about the idea of the brain healing itself. I'm a firm believer that it is seriously about giving yourself what you wanted. There's a pleasure system in our brain that continuously wants, and I think most trauma survivors are reluctant to addressing really deep-rooted wants from the self because we have never prioritized the self. We have never looked into the eyes of our inner child and asked her what she wants in this very moment. An exercise I used to do when I first started inner child work was during a really bad panic attack, one of those, or a fit of rage, those that make you break down in tears. Once I broke down, I let myself feel and release those emotions. I would be able to feel my inner child more closely in that vulnerable state, and I would ask her what she wanted in that moment. She seemed more genuine in that moment, and 9 times out of 10, what that girl said to me was, "I want love." She wanted comfort, reassurance, and care, and it made much sense where that came from, because never once in my life do I remember being comforted or reassured. I have no recollection of ever being held, especially in times of distress. And as an adult, I see that shift my life took, and I see as an adult that I have this almost overwhelming support system that I longed so much for during my childhood. It is truly bittersweet when we look at this contrast, because as much as I wanted my childhood self to experience what I have now, to be able to know what it's like to not cry alone anymore, to not have to carry my burdens by myself, given that I am at the age where I could carry them by myself, I don't. It represents what the little girl inside of me was able to give me as an adult. She was able to give me what I have now, since she never had it. She fought for me to have what I have now, and I'm incredibly grateful to be in a place where I can receive an outpour of love and support. But on the other hand, the simple knowledge of knowing that this little girl, who always had to be so strong, to carry burdens that not even a full-grown adult should carry, that she had to do that by herself for years on end, really does destroy me. It really makes me upset knowing that she'll never have that, and she'll never know what it's like to be loved when she's upset. And I'm sure many of you in similar situations feel the same way, feeling like you want vengeance for your inner child that you can't seem to obtain. But if you can give yourself what your inner child never had, I think that's what's going to overpower everything. So from this, we define neuroplasticity as the act of mending wounds, and I see it as if your brain is made up of many little parts, and it's our job as adults to satisfy each one of those parts that are lit up. They're little because they have not been met. These needs have not been met, and I've heard all this comes with a lot of inner child work. It comes with a lot of personal work on yourself, and it comes with simply thinking of what your greatest, deepest desires have been for your inner child, how you can meet them now, because believe it or not, they are still in you, and there is nothing more beautiful than closing wounds. And not only is it right, but you deserve to have those needs met. When healing takes place, the brain begins to form new neural connections. The brain is able to detach itself from connections made during a point of survival and construct and adopt new perceptions, ideas, or thinking patterns of a person who's not just living to survive anymore. I saw that when I began my journey of healing. What started to change first were different perceptions of myself. I started to think a little bit differently. I went from a putting myself last person to how can I benefit myself person. I adopted this how can I help myself be better mindset. This sounds prideful, but when put into words, but to me, it was a complete 180 from the people pleasing, my needs and my wants didn't matter attitude that I have of kept for so long in fear of being left by people. I grew to learn that people do leave, and there is nothing you can say or nothing you can do to make them stay. It's how relationships work. It's how they come and go. But the idea that each day I was healing myself and forming perceptions about myself, which exemplified my self-worth, this is what allowed me to be okay with that, which allowed me to handle rejection better and allow failures to look like opportunities of growth. Along with prioritizing the meeting of needs, it is essential to live in an environment that promotes our healing. We've heard the saying that we cannot heal if we are in the same environment that hurt us. And I get that realistically, it may not be possible to do that, to completely move away, to completely separate yourself from relatives who hurt you. But doing it as much as possible to put yourself in a safe, positive environment, surrounded by people who want to help you grow, who can guide you, mentor you, and support you in your dreams, the changes will be extraordinary. The brain will rewire itself if you create new habits on how to live. We must continuously repeat healthy coping mechanisms, repeatedly tell ourselves that we are deserving of love, and frequently meeting our inner child where they are and what they want to see happen. It takes years, but it happens. Like many treatments, it will all be a regimen that one may have to do for the rest of their lives. But the brain is powerful enough to relearn and to reprogram itself into a new version of you. As we get into the practice of these habits, we start to train the fear responses in our brains, our amygdala's fear receptors, to not become as reactive with any signs of danger, until eventually a memory of something will not associate to negative strong emotions, but instead be able to reason with the setting and realistically view the threat with adult lenses and reason. Treatments such as EMDR are there to rewire the brain, to allow for less intense reactions to the trigger, and to allow us for better memory and recall and understanding. Our minds are so strong and resilient. So thank you for listening to this episode on the impact of childhood trauma on the brain. Stay around for the next episode.